Okay, so there is a lot going on. We are having a panel about the current moment, about the crisis. But given all of the things that are happening today, that could mean so many different things. That could mean the COVID-19 public health crisis that's happening. That could mean the economic crisis that's actively unfolding. That can mean the global uprisings that have been happening and are happening. So what we're going to do is we're really going to focus on the economic crisis in this panel. And we'll explain our logic for why we want to do that too. And hopefully it will be a way for us to touch on the other things, but that will be our main focus. So the plan, our plan for the panel is hopefully we will not talk for more than an hour. Actually, when we ran through it yesterday, we were way under time. So hopefully you won't hear us for too long. We're going to go through some quick definitions that will elucidate Marxist crisis theory, because that's the lens that we're going to be using today. And then we're just going to do, just a really peppy 100 years of capitalism, just something light and amuse-bouche of history. And then we're going to hit on the 2020 crisis, open the floor for some questions, any clarifying questions we have, take a little bit of a break, come back together, do these breakout groups, and then come back together as a larger group and have a discussion. Cool? Okay, so crisis theory, what is that? So Marx's entire theory of capital is crisis theory, really. His argument is that crisis is inherent to capitalism. So this doesn't mean that crisis is happening necessarily at every given moment in capital. Sometimes capitalism is having a fantastic time and it's not experiencing crisis, but it is a quality that is internal to it. And the idea of the falling rate of profit is really, really central to this. One of our comrades in UNS, Enzo, is going to do a dive for us on what that means, but keep in mind, falling rate of profit is central to why capitalism is in crisis. It is, that is crisis theory. And then we have some type of counteracting tendencies that happen because of the fact that capital is constantly going in and out of crisis, because it's constantly trying to counteract the fact that it is going through a falling rate of profit. It does other things to try and make up for it. So this creates some type of counteracting tendencies, some different forces. So why understand crisis theory? I think this quote is, study of crisis is the study of class struggle. I think that's from Harry Cleaver, Marxist economist. But that's really what it is, helping, allowing us to understand this, allows us to understand in what ways the class might be further squeezed, further repressed. It helps us to understand the ways capital might try to, quote unquote, course correct for itself. And it could even help us to theorize about where we could see struggle emerging and under what type of conditions. So therefore, it informs our revolutionary strategy. So we think as revolutionaries, it's actually really, really important for us to understand this. And it's a fantastic argument for revolution. I mean, if this is the way it's supposed to operate, that's a problem. So, shout out to KD for creating this Rubik's Cube graphic, by the way. We have a lot of incredible memes that are coming your way shortly too. But Kay created this so that we can kind of understand that capital is a social relation, right? We can view it from one side. We can look at capital, we can look at the class, we can look at race, but it's all connected, and we are just using it as a lens that touches on each of the sides, right? So we'll be focusing on capital, but by speaking about this, we are speaking about the other things, and we'll dive more into that too in the breakout groups. And then honestly, y'all, we want to steal from the university. We want to bring this knowledge to ourselves, to revolutionaries, to radicals, to organizers who are on the ground doing this work, because we understand that in our hands, it is a more sharpened tool. we are here to use these things to change the world, not just talk about it. Okay, so there are three premises that we're gonna kind of take for granted in this presentation, in this conversation. We're gonna try and elaborate on them, but these are the three premises that we're taking for granted. One, MCM prime, money, commodity, money. What do we really need to understand from that? Just that capital must accumulate or die. Capital has to accumulate or die. And that capital erodes the basis for its own existence. It's like eating itself alive. And every single time capital tries to recover, the solutions for the recovery are reproducing the fundamental conflict. So these are three things that we'll dive into more, but these are three things that we'll take for granted and will inform our conversation. So we're gonna start diving into these definitions. I'm gonna pass it off to Enzo to explain this amazing graphic and the falling rate of profit.
Okay, thank you. So when we think about the falling rate of profit, we need to remember that a commodity's value is primarily made of a worker's labor, primarily but not exclusively. So essentially, the time and effort that a person puts into making a commodity primarily influences its value. And in this case, value is not exactly profit, but analogous in this case. So MCM, capital has to reproduce itself. So in the capitalist pursuit of never-ending capital accumulation, we have the capitalist introduces efficiencies into the production process. So efficiencies, machinery, automation, all of these things. Now, these things are also replacing labor of workers. So as you include more and more machinery, automation, you are actively expelling workers from the production process. But remember that a commodity's value is primarily made up of workers' labor and putting that labor into the product. So as you expel more and more workers from the labor process and from production, the value that is imbued in that commodity lessens and lessens over time. And so that is on a micro scale, but as a macro, the rate of profit, the value, and its ability to be met in an exchange decreases over time. That's the falling rate of profit.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to take primitive accumulation then. So primitive accumulation means a few things depending on who you're talking to. The basic definition of it is the separation of the producers, the people who make things, from the means of production. And it's important to note that this means accumulating both constant capital, which is like land, technology, resources, and variable capital, which is labor, and also cultures and histories. It requires force, and it renews the conditions for capitalist exploitation. So if you talk to some people, they'll say that this is a particular historical moment. And like if you've read Marx's Capital Volume 1 or something, you might think of the enclosures in Western Europe pushing people off the land and into the factories or some version of that. Essentially this transition from feudalism to capitalism. And then others have come along like Silvia Federici and expanded this to include, look beyond just Western Europe, to include colonization, slavery, the witch hunts, for instance. And then you might hear us interchange the words primitive accumulation and ongoing accumulation because we think that this is a continual process. We're not the first ones to say this, of course, but it's a continual process that continuously also requires force. And for that, you can picture things like the IMF and World Bank strategies, but maybe also like some people like David Harvey look at the destruction of public housing as another kind of primitive accumulation or ongoing accumulation. So I'll pass it off.
Cool. So I got chapter talk about overaccumulation. This is where we start to get from your sort of foundational ways that the Marxist tradition talks about crises to the different kind of mutating crisis theories that develop over time. Because capitalism keeps going into crisis, well, it evolves and takes on different forms. And Marxists throughout the 19th century and 20th century keep developing different crisis theories. We aren't even like experts in all of these, and we're not even talking about all of them necessarily. There's a whole school of like disproportionality theories. There's a bunch of Marxists that sort of turn Keynesian and talk about underconsumption theories. But one of the kind of classic typical common forms that crisis tends to take, which the Marxist tradition identified like when it was literally like Marx and Engels in the 19th century, was overaccumulation, by which they, at the time, they sort of understood as like capitalists producing more commodities than can be profitably sold. And so for some, the word overaccumulation and overproduction are the same thing. I'm kind of distinguishing them just because a lot's happened since the 1850s, and maybe that overaccumulation can be a slightly broader term than just there's too many commodities that you can profitably take to market. But the general principle is kind of the same, which I think is intuitive. If we know a little bit about capitalism, we can understand it. You know, simply the fact that competition among capitalists compels them to suck more surplus value out of the working class than can be realized. And the sort of classic way that happens, Engels in the 1870s, is like, yo, this is happening. They suck the surplus value out in the form of these physical commodities that then they can't sell. And that doesn't just happen at one period of time and then go away. We see that continue. That's a feature of crises that keep happening, like this guy that's dumping milk a couple months ago because you can't market the damn milk anymore. But I wanted to kind of add a few other dimensions to it, right? So you can think of overaccumulation in that form, and overaccumulation of surplus value in the form of commodities that can't be sold. But maybe if we're a little flexible with it, we can think of the same dynamic driving different forms of overaccumulation. And as capitalism continues to kind of mutate, it might do it in different ways. So Robert Brenner, who's a political Marxist, has in his books on the recent crises, really from like the 90s and 2000s on, one thing that he puts his finger on is after the 1970s, capitalism in the US and Europe and Japan in the sort of developed cores run into a crisis of overcapacity, sort of like overproduction of commodities. But in this case, he's like, check out what's happening. These capitalists have, they're compelled to compete with one another. They invest in fancy new factories to produce tons of cars and outcompete with one another. But the price of cars is continually falling as the markets get saturated. And so they've invested in all this machinery that can no longer pay for itself. So not only are there cars you can't market, but there's machines you can't fucking use, which is why the capitalists are like, let's run Flint into the ground, not pay to fix up this machinery, just run it till the wheels fall off and then move it somewhere else. And you could even see maybe, I don't know, other Marxist ninjas on this call maybe weigh in later, but like could we see some of the asset bubbles that are taking place now with fictitious capital as a kind of over accumulation? This is like you're paying the analysts and the clerks and the Excel sheet gurus at investment firms to produce commodities. Those commodities are financial instruments. Their use value is a claim on future surplus value. And then when that doesn't come due, well, then the commodity goes bust. I don't know. But you could see these different forms of overaccumulation happening in different ways as capitalism continues to expand, and you kind of get the mechanism underneath it. They're compelled to compete with one another. They can't tell if there isn't the capacity to consume what they produce ahead of time, and even if there isn't, they think they can get over on one another or expand markets, so they're going to do it. Last thing, you can view the relationship between the falling rate of profit and these various forms of crises of overaccumulation in different ways. Different Marxists do this different ways. So in the 70s, lots of Marxists, they're all debating one another, which is the primary crisis and which is a secondary accidental one. And you know, which is more important? My feeling is the best way to view it is that you can view the falling rate of profit as sort of the underlying condition that makes other forms of crises, including all these different forms of crises of overaccumulation that I talked about, more likely and more severe. So if an overaccumulation crisis is like, could be cyclical, it could be just boom and bust, up and down, and a falling rate of profit is that downward line, a downward trend, you could see the two sort of combine in actual fact like a wave that keeps getting lower the further it goes to the right, which is, I think we'll actually see in some of the charts later. The metaphor I thought of was like, it's maybe the relationship between overall climate change and particular crises like hurricanes or something. What's the cause of the crisis? Well, it's a change of 1 degree Celsius in the atmosphere, but there's also various proximate causes that cause mass flooding or that cause famine or whatever. But there's a relationship between the two. And maybe falling rate of profit is like the deep underlying mechanism, and the other crises are a little more proximate. So there you go, that's my overaccumulation. Pass it on.
Okay, so I'm going to explain something it's a little separate, but then I think our hosts Kay and Sada are going to kind of bring it all together. So this is just kind of like a separate like side note. So contracted social reproduction and social reproduction in general. Social reproduction for Marx is the abstract process of renewing capitalist social relations. So bear with me. So I find it helpful to think about this concept being the centrifugal force of a merry-go-round. So without wind resistance or friction or whatever, let's just say we're in space, one push to the right allows the merry-go-round to move to the right and then back to the left and around and to spin and keep coming in and going around and around. So it'll use that initial push to keep spinning and renewing the cycle over and over again. Social reproduction is that process for capitalism, but not only does it absorb the initial push, it actually gets pushed every time it comes around by human labor, getting faster and faster on an exponential scale. So that's the cue to click. Thanks. Exactly. So some Marxist feminists and activists kind of reduce this concept of this sort of broader abstract concept of social reproduction to a set of concrete labors, reproductive labor or care work. So they have shorthanded this concept to sort of the things we do every day to go back to work, or like everything we need to do to be able to go back to work the next day. This is an incomplete understanding, and it's kind of a side note about a juicy debate between some of the Marxist feminists, but that's for another time. But the point is that social reproduction encompasses many forms of reproduction or care labor, but also objective phenomena. So some examples of more objective phenomena are the reproduction or renewal of race and gender relations, family and communal structures of institutions, and just basically the entire society we're born into and contribute to renewing on a daily basis. For the purposes of our conversation today, it's important to see social reproduction as something larger than just care work, because squeezing or contracting social reproduction is one of the strategies that the capitalist rulers use to manage economic and political crises. And oh my gosh, I'm sorry, a side note, no cats were hurt in the making of this meme. Just for the record, I'm a vegan and I love animals, so, and we love cats, all of us, so. So not only do the capitalist rulers force the burden of reproductive or care work onto the working class, but they also shift the entire terrain that we're born into and reproduce daily. So again, it's not just the concrete labors like education, healthcare, working longer hours, and shittier jobs just to meet our needs. I mean, this is all true, but contracted social reproduction is actually bigger and more abstract than that. Gender and race relations, the neighborhoods and type of housing we find ourselves in, basically all the social and economic objective conditions of our society are shifted. So it's like over time, they're able to change the shape of the merry-go-round itself. I'm sorry, I'm going into my own outer space, so I'm just gonna stop. But hopefully we can marinate on this a bit and get back to it more in conversation about contracted social reproduction and how that affects our moment.
Didn't know there was more to the graphic. Thank you. That was great. So I'm going to take us now and hopefully try to connect a lot of these things that we've outlined at the beginning to start us on the really quick 100 years of capitalist history. So obviously it's going to be a super just shallow overview to some extent, but we'll see where it takes us at the end. So I want to start with this kind of interwar period, or what we commonly think of in like US history as the Great Depression. This is a reflection of the general crisis of the falling rate of profit. There's also that overaccumulation at this time. The second 2 decades of the 20th century, and even right prior to that, were marked by this kind of overaccumulation that's spurred largely by the Second Industrial Revolution. The stock market crashes due to soaring asset prices. And so you have value reflected in the market, or showing in the market, that's above the value in the like value producing economy. And I'll use that term instead of real economy, because I think that I put it in the slide, but I think it actually gives us a false dichotomy, or like relationship between financial markets and the value producing economy. And there's also at this time low liquidity, which means there's like they have to solve this problem of there's not enough money in circulation. Also, there's intense class struggle going on globally. There's like the communist threats and anarchist threats globally. There's huge labor movements in the US. And the 1930s is this time of attempt at economic recovery programs. And also it's a time of heightened class struggle because of the global depression. And what this means is this threatens kind of a total crisis for capital. But we pause here because this is so important to keep in mind, because everyone's saying now like this right now is worse. The economic crisis we're in today in 2020 is perhaps worse than the Great Depression. But we should keep in mind that economic crashes don't necessarily mean total crisis for capital. In fact, sometimes rationalization and concentration often step in and allow capital to continue floating along. And also sometimes capital requires, though, huge adjustments in the political, ideological, and economic realms to be able to continue floating along. And that's what happens in this period, it's kind of huge adjustments. World War II comes along, and during World War II, economic stuff not always doing so great, but a war economy means production is super ramped up, consumption's ramped up. There's also a mass destruction of value occurring, and the like clearest picture of that is literal mass death, but also the destruction of constant capital all over the countries who are engaged in war. And what this does is it resets the basis of value, so this process of accumulation can begin anew. We see also coming out of World War II a restructuring of the world economy. The US is on top and able to basically prey on other capitals and fund other capitals, other countries' capitals as well, and come out on top of this. What this means is the crisis is temporarily staved off. And so we enter the post-war economy. And we'll talk about the post-war economy roughly to like the late 60s, early 70s here. This is a period where the cost of social reproduction is thrown onto the state. And this looks like public debt largely. So this is a period where suddenly state deficits are acceptable. We have Keynesianism step in here as like the dominant economic theory that's winning the day. What this means is class struggle also has to be incorporated though into capitalist production and into the state, because there's class struggle preceding this moment. And you have to find some way to incorporate it so it doesn't keep bubbling up, right? And it's also like outright attacked. And this is where we see things like union mediations, expanded civil rights, racial integration, but also rising real wages. But there's an issue. The value of labor power in this time is fixed by all these like policies from governments fixing it, and because of the threat of class struggle and stuff, they can't stay fixed, right? Because this is how capitalists actually extract their surplus value. So fixed labor costs means a problem for capital accumulation. At the time, Keynesianism works because the rate of profit was high, which allowed it to work for a period, but then it comes up against slowing growth, and accumulation slows, so another restructuring is needed. I'll pass it to Sada.
Okay. So not the 1770s, the 1970s to now. This is kind of a slow burn that we see happening. So we see the social reproduction of the class thrown on. Now it's thrown onto the class. This is the first time that we're seeing rampant neoliberalism. Like we saw little sparks here and there before. This is the first time they're like, you know what, handle it yourself. So while some might argue that the move towards neoliberal austerity was a political move, we're putting you in your place, we're showing you who's boss after this period of the 60s where you were being too rowdy, it's also objectively, the capitalists kind of have to do it to counteract the falling rate of profit. So then that's how we see social reproduction being thrown onto the class. That's how we see things like general immiseration. And immiseration means that wages are thrown below the value of labor power. And this also means blooming private debt. So we see now you can't really afford your life, I'll take out some private debt, and maybe you can. And then we're also seeing a restructuring of capital overall. Things are moving to the global south where they can pay less. There's a lower cost of labor power. And then we're also seeing political move abroad of the US and other Western powers pretty much trying to like coup the post-colonial regimes, right? That were trying to offer maybe some type of reforms to their people, and they're like, no more. We want to enact our capitalist will. And then we're also seeing more moves to the financial sector. So capitalists here can make kind of like a quick buck. They can make quick profits because rather than actually extracting more and more surplus value, they can speculate on the already extracted surplus value. This leads to things like asset bubbles, and they're extracting from already existing surpluses. So the rate of accumulation remains low with overaccumulation and fictitious capital. Kind of what Chino was saying before, is this something that we can see? We think so. And it's just really claims on future wealth. There's no actual guarantee of value creation at all. So I'll pass it back to Kate to talk a little bit about secular crisis.
Yeah. So I want to, and like Chino said before, it's like we're all still trying to work out kind of where we're at in our understanding of crisis theory currently. But you might have heard people talk about cyclical crisis. Some mainstream economists, of course, like outright deny crisis and say it's all external factors, but some will say, no, there are cyclical crises within capital, and maybe it's caused by external factors, or maybe it's some stuff internal. And then some, like orthodox Marxists, will also look at these cyclical crises. And this is a chart, this guy, this economist, Michael Roberts, who's a Marxist, has made it his pet project, again, to try to prove the falling rate of profit, which is fun. But in these cases, like big capital eats up little capital. It often involves a mass destruction of capital or of value, and accumulation might begin anew. But others say that while there has been cyclical crisis throughout capital, that we've been in a secular crisis roughly since the late 1960s. They're saying that there hasn't been an opportunity for the basis of accumulation to be reset. And so there's this continuing threat to capital which persists through these temporary ups and downs and hasn't yet hit its bottom. And they call this maybe the secular crisis. So that brings us to now. So what happened? Well, actually it brings us to 2008 first. I think of now, but that was a while ago now. But what happens here? So overaccumulation and contracted social reproduction are kind of our background. It's still going on. The fundamental crisis at this point hasn't been resolved. It was only masked by private debt propping up consumption. So everything looked really good. The stock market looked really good, but underneath it was just waiting to happen. So the stock market here is a mess. Again, we have the value of assets, which are above the value in value producing economy. And this is a really visible result. This is what we all see, of course. Nobody can pay their enormous debts, which means a lot of working class people defaulting on their mortgages and other debts, but it also means the capitalists can't pay their debts. They're super indebted and can't do it. So we have mass unemployment too at this time, 10 million people losing their homes just in the US. That's of course over a period of years. So what happens? What's the response to this crash? Well, the state steps in with all these strategies. What happens globally is all of these world central banks bail out capital. They're lower the interest rates to encourage more investment. So capitalists will take out more money, borrow more money, and invest it back into market. They're also increasing the supply of money so that this can happen to lubricate these transactions and keep everything running, and directly bailing out banks and firms. Another thing that we see is that Oh, and I'll say with this too, this though, again, prevents the big firms from eating up little firms at the level that was maybe needed. And we also see a deepening of contracted social reproduction. So for instance, a good example of this is actually the healthcare bill in the US, the Affordable Care Act, which everyone was all gung-ho about, but actually further privatized healthcare, throwing the cost further onto the individual workers. We see too, basically sacrificing the class. Mass mortgage defaults are happening, but there's no bailouts to the class, of course. And there's job creation during this time or coming out of this crisis, right? And that's where the job numbers look much better over the years. But I'm sure many of us are aware that the so-called recovery was tending towards more part-time and low-wage job creation than the more stable jobs that existed maybe in some fantastical history that we want to believe happened. But it is true that there's more low-wage and part-time jobs occurring. Also, there's this continuation of private debt. So right now, the class actually holds more private debt than it did before the 2008 crash. It was essentially, capitalism doesn't really quite learn its lesson and continue that private debt. What happens here is that all this resulting expansion, it doesn't renew investment directly into production. The capitalists are tending to run their machinery into the ground and infrastructure into the ground and choose to invest increasingly more into financial markets. Again, they can get income from the already existing surpluses. And this threatens, of course, though, to lead to more speculative stock market bubbles and inflated asset prices. And what we have here is an appearance of accumulation leading up to 2020, while at the same time, the real surpluses are stagnating and the claims on the future surpluses are multiplying. That takes us to now. So important to know that coming out of that crisis and the recovery of that crisis, the conditions for a crisis now already existed prior to COVID-19. And we're hearing like all over the news, people saying that it's just because of the economic crisis is just because of COVID, just because of COVID. But it was in fact looming. Michael Roberts shows that corporate debt levels globally were already at record highs before the pandemic. In most major economies, and even in the larger emerging economies, growth and investment had already slowed almost to a trickle, and corporate profits had stopped growing, except for in basically like big tech, which somehow big tech is still doing really well right now. But so the profitability of capital in the major economies was historically low. So we want to look at the pandemic as like a tipping point, which pushes the economy into crisis. And it also reveals the erosion of the living conditions through decades of contracted social reproduction of the global working class. But then important to note that due to like the combination of both effective measures by states of shutting things down to try to stop the virus, but also like the failure of states to contain the pandemic entirely, like in the US, there's been a historically unprecedented contraction in production. And of course, we've all seen like the really, what to me, when this news came out about the 33% contraction in the US GDP, everyone acted shocked. I was like, we all knew that this was coming. And real quickly, for those of y'all who have seen that, I think some of these like mainstream economic terms are a little bit mysterious or something, but GDP is the way that they will measure the total value of production of goods and services in the economy. Just like private consumption, could see why that might take a hit. Gross investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. Okay. So what happens with this huge contraction? This has never happened before. And frankly, nobody knows yet what this will mean, that we just had kind of a months-long stop or really intense decrease in production. And so the mainstream economists and political hacks are mostly continuing to parrot this like baseless optimism about the recovery, saying there's going to be a V-shaped recovery or there's going to be a W-shaped recovery. But at the same time, we can see like JP Morgan, for instance, setting aside $10 billion to prepare for loan defaults. There's some recognition that shit is really bad, with some also kind of baseless, fantastical faith that things will just recover. So what's been the response so far?
All right, printing money. I mean, that's definitely been a part of the response so far, is printing lots of money, lowering interest rates, maybe lowering them to something like the 2008 levels or lower. Some interesting thing I heard from an economist was like, can we have negative interest rates, which is wild. So the desire is to bail out capital, right? If you print a lot of money, if you lower the interest rates, hopefully the capitalists will invest. And hopefully this will stave off total market collapse in their logic. But we're already seeing governments take out huge loans. The loans that they've taken out up until this point are about twice as large as the stimulus and bailout from '08. And we're like just sort of in the beginning of things, right? And of course, what does this do? It creates a bubble again. And then, of course, the human sacrifice, right? This is they try and make it sound nice by saying essential worker, and all of these supermarkets are like, we love our essential workers. What are they actually doing? They're putting people of color, Black and brown people, women, undocumented people on the front line, and they're not compensating them, which also makes clear to us who has been the value producers this entire time, right? Also, children are being sacrificed. We're seeing the education system completely unable to even think of a way to have children be educated in a positive and good way virtually, right? Because the education system was horrible to begin with. So what we're facing may be children not being educated in any real proper good way for a couple of years, who knows? But again, what is the response to this? People are fighting back. So we're seeing, before this most recent Black rebellion, a bunch of wildcat strikes from Instacart workers to Amazon workers. We are seeing mass movement happening. And what else are they probably going to continue to do? Just continue to disinvest in our reproduction. They're trying to give us minimal temporary relief, those horrible stimulus checks that took forever to come. I mean, I liked it, but it was one. The unemployment benefits that ran out yesterday, in comparison to the corporate relief that we're seeing. So much being given to bail out entire industries. But again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding that labor power is what creates value. And so they're therefore kind of digging their own grave. So what tools are left for them? This is us kind of just looking at history and trying to figure it out. Maybe they'll try to have some type of war in order to have some type of ongoing accumulation, whether that's a boots on the ground type of war or something else. But the question is, again, like, what is left to loot? Are there certain industries that they can loot, or certain lands? More cheap labor, what does that mean? Continuing to resort to unfree labor. So prison populations, proto-slave populations abroad and at home. Continuation of cheap credit and high liquidity, print more money. Again, this can't last forever. This is what we keep saying. This is a bubble. They're printing money, they're investing in things like the stock market too, which is why it looks like the stock market is doing well, even though everything else is kind of like on fire. You see all these articles that the stock market isn't doing too bad. But they're not investing in production itself. And honestly, can we blame them? It doesn't really make sense to invest in production at this exact moment. And then we know, like, there's this vague thing that state deficits have limits, right? But the question is, what is the limit? We really don't know. I don't think we've seen a moment that could answer that question for us. And we're now seeing state deficits ballooning globally, and we don't have a hard number to answer that. We're probably going to see further contracted social reproduction, but again, in a country like the United States, what is left to abandon? And then there's this, very ahistorical conversation happening about resetting the economy that maybe you'll have seen from some of the like global elite and bourgeois economists. This is a wake-up call. We have to have some type of a like New Deal to bail us out, some type of a kinder, more gentle capitalism. But if y'all remember, this is not based in an understanding of the falling rate of profit, right? It's an ahistorical belief that makes us think that we can be kind of corrected to some form of Keynesianism that's more humane, but that cuts into the already falling profits for the capitalists. And then we're not sure what else. This is part of us having this conversation with you. We really, yeah, they're innovative folks. So we could see some things that we can't even, think about in this moment. So I'll pass it back to Kay for a sec.
Thanks. So that brings us then to the current moment. And this is like our last slide. And we're going to do this group activity where we can all talk and then not just listen to us talk anymore. So what is our current moment? What's our terrain now? So there's a weakened legitimacy of the state. And we're seeing that not just here, but also globally with many existing governments. So when movements maybe before more common, lots of social movements for reforms over the last couple of years, we're seeing instead of these social movements for reforms, like outright demands to replace leaders, entire governments or sections of the government, or demands for total restructuring. And we see that kind of in the growth of the call for social democracy, for instance. And this is both a response to rising authoritarianism. People are angry about the authoritarianism and that's weakening some legitimacy, but also sometimes the fact that the states are weakened a bit is spawning a growth towards authoritarianism in the state itself. There's also a possibility of some global restructuring of world powers here. We have this like China-US trade war, China, Russia, Iran forming military exercise blocks. And we won't speculate too much about that, but good to get into later. We also have capitalists resorting to sometimes really extreme measures in some cases. Specifically here in the US, I'm sure everyone's heard, I think it was I can't remember the asshole's name, but saying that grandparents should be willing to die for the economic future of their grandchildren, and just like sacrifice the elderly people, right? It's like, oh my gosh. There's mass unemployment already. And there's been all this like baseless optimism about the employment numbers. And then last week's unemployment numbers came out and they're like, oh no, it's bad. And also looming mass eviction, which is coming down at any point in the next few months here. And it's a potential that the level of evictions we'll see will be like 3 times or up almost towards 3 times what we saw during the 2008 housing crisis, but instead of over a period of years, over a period of a few months. And also at the same time, of course, there's still this environmental crisis that we're all living in, which is spawning things like a growth in migration globally, and also threatening existential crisis for all of humanity. But one thing is the class struggle now is widespread, so that's good. But right now, if we look at maybe the last 100, 200 years, the class struggle still remains relatively unorganized as compared with these earlier historical periods.